Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to make realistic looking beaches and shorelines for your wargaming table. Although this is a diorama, this was a Christmas gift for one of my relatives, I do believe that a lot of the techniques that I use in making this diorama could be easily translated to boards or terrain pieces on any given wargaming table, especially my integration of the faux fur with a bunch of different phlox and other more traditional foliage materials. But first things first, for this diorama, I just chose this simple circular wood base, which I believe is originally meant for like a clock, which I got at a local craft store. And then I just cut out some different pieces of pink foam to roughly match the diameter or circumference of the wood. And then I'm just going to cut into the top layer of foam, where I'll be having a little bit of a rolling hill with some grass that meets with the beach. So I'm just cutting this out to make, when I sand it down, a little bit easier on me. And then I'm going to take a nice wire brush here. I'm going to scrape up the foam, and then I'll be gluing it down onto the wood base. And I find that scraping up the foam, it works so much better. It gets a much tighter bond when you try and glue it to anything. So that's why I did that. And then, of course, just to weigh it down, I put on some large books and let it dry overnight. And once the glue is dried, I'm going to be using a Dremel and a hand sander to shape the foam to match kind of the silhouette that I had in mind for this diorama. So I'm taking the hand sander here, and I'm going to create a kind of a steep slope for where the beach meets what will be the ocean. And I'm going to be pouring resin, so I want there to be a slope so that there'll be some depth to the resin. And since the resin is translucent, you'll be like you're looking down at the bottom of this ocean with waves crashing. I think it'll give a nice cool effect. So I'm just sanding it down, and hand sander is an amazing tool to use with this foam. It really is able to shape it very quickly. Just make sure that you're wearing a ventilator or a mask, because it shoots out tons of nasty particles. And then I'm just going around with this sander, and I'm also making sure to sand away any of the overhang from the wooden base. The wooden base has a nice little lip that I want to use to help create a dam for the resin, so I need to make sure that it is flush with the board. And then I'm just taking the Dremel, and I actually removed it from the top layer. I found it was easier, and I'm carving away what will be this little slope, little hill meeting the beach. And I have this idea of this being like a very sandy, kind of sand dune hill with tufts of grass covering it, and a little path leading down the middle. So I'm just using the hand sander to kind of carve out where I want that path there in the middle, and also to just ensure that those rough Dremel marks are a little bit smoother. And so, again, really great tool when working with this polystyrene. And so now you can see the result of my sanding, a nice smooth beachhead, and also the sides of the polystyrene are flush with that lip around the base. And now that I'm done with the sanding, I'm going to be adding this DOS air dry clay to the entirety of what will be the beachhead diorama to give a lot of texture. I've used the clay in a lot of previous videos recently because, one thing, I like that it's not toxic, unlike caulk or filler, and also that as you work it into your terrain pieces, you get small little undulations, especially when you're trying to simulate earth, and it looks really realistic. You know, when you look at a piece of ground cover anywhere, it's not completely flat. There's little divots, potholes, things like that. So as you're just spreading this clay out, you get that naturally. And once we have it completely covered in clay and it's dried, now we're going to start adding the grass to the diorama here, the shoreline. And for that, I'm going to be, again, using faux fur, which I'm going to brush pretty vigorously here to get rid of any excess hair, any loose fur. That'll save you a lot of trouble when you start painting the thing. And I'm also going to cut it out here to meet kind of the dimensions that I need for this diorama, cutting around the edges. And I will glue this down shortly here with super glue. One thing to remember, do not try and glue fur down with PVA glue. For whatever reason, the PVA wicks up through the faux fur and causes a mess. So stick with CA glue, with super glue, and you will not have that problem. So I'll stick that on there, and I will do the other side of the hill, and we will have our grass initially glued down. And once the glue is dried, I'm going to take some clippers and start shaving away areas where I want some sand to be showing through the grass. These can be pathways by animals or humans walking around, or just places where the grass isn't growing and the beach is showing through. And once I have the initial shape of the grass that I want, it's time to start spray painting it. So I'm going to first spray paint it with kind of this yellow, green, this lime color. Then I'm going to go and just spray in a few places with a dark kind of hunter green, and then top it all off with a light, bright yellow. And then I'll take a comb and I'll work it through the fur. You want to make sure you get to it pretty quickly before the spray paint starts to dry, and then it becomes kind of a mess. Once we got the initial color down on our grass, it's time to put the sand down on our diorama. So here I'm just adding some Mod Podge all over the areas where I want there to be a beachhead. Then I'm taking this mixture of fine grit sand and baking soda. I really like how this looks. I think it looks like really fine sand that you'd find on a beach. And instead of using grout or something, baking soda is safe. And as you apply watered down PVA or watered down Mod Podge to it, it actually kind of creates this paste which hardens your beach, so you won't have to worry about sand getting everywhere and falling off your diorama. It's pretty great. So again, now I'm just adding sand to all the little pathways and places where the sand is showing through the diorama, and I think it looks pretty realistic. And we'll be covering it again with watered down glues to help keep that sand in place. Now we're going to make sure our grass looks a little bit more realistic. So first thing I do when I work with faux fur is I put down really dark colors, my dark greens, and work that into random places throughout the grass. So here you can see I have this really dark hunter green and then a dark green brown mixed in there. And then once I have the dark colors in there, I'll start mixing in lighter ones. So here I added a livery green by Vallejo in different places around the fur to brighten it up a little bit, to give some contrast in the grass. If you look at a field, no two blades of grass seemingly are the same color. You got a lot of variation in the greens and yellows in there. So I used a ton of different colors, maybe almost a dozen colors of green and yellow, and I work it in different spots, use the comb to blend it in with the surrounding grass, and it gets you a really realistic look. I think the most realistic grass comes from these faux fur techniques. And so I keep blending the grass in there, and then I begin working in, once I have kind of the initial greens and yellows in there that I like, I start mixing in flesh tones. So here I'm mixing in a dark cadmium skin tone from Vallejo, and then I'll mix in some pale skin tones, some pink based skin tones, but they all look fantastic as kind of these high highlights for the grass. And you just continually work them in until you get something that you're satisfied. I'm actually working off a photograph that I got from a beach from Northampton, England. These are a bunch of Vikings, so I imagine that they're going to be hitting somewhere in northern England for this diorama. So I looked at some pictures and pretty much matched the grass as best I could. So using photographs as a frame of reference for coloring foliage is always a good idea. So again, adding in here now the lightest skin tones, and play around with this. If you get a color that you don't like, if you think your grass doesn't look very realistic, just start blending in some more greens or put in some more yellows in there. If you got an unnatural green tone, you really can't mess this up. The more colors you put in there, actually the more realistic it looks. So if you put the time into this, you can get some really amazing results. And so now I'm going to try something new. So I took some watered down Mod Podge, put it on a brush here, and I'm just touching the tops of the faux fur and then adding in a bunch of different kinds of flock. So here's some coarse flock by Woodland Scenics, the light green, and also some dark green over here. And I'm adding that in, and I think it looks like pieces of weeds growing amongst the grass or small bushes, and it just rounds off the silhouette a little bit more. And I think it only makes the faux fur even more realistic looking as far as grass goes. So I'm taking light colors of flock, mostly yellows, and also fine turf here. I'm sprinkling on this fine turf meadow flowers onto portions of the faux fur, and then I'm also using some blended earth, which is good for simulating dried leaves and things like that, and I'm putting that up along the inner trailhead. And I'm also putting in my favorite stuff, which is the burnt grass, to kind of tie all the disparate colors of the grass together. And I've actually tried this. You can do this if you're quick enough without adding any Mod Podge or glue. Just after you brush in your paint, just add whatever flock you want to it, and as the paint dries, it will kind of adhere the flock to it and it doesn't clump up the fur. So in the future, I will be using that instead of the Mod Podge. I think that was a better result in the end. And now to increase the realism to the scene, I'm adding a bunch of other pieces of foliage. So here are some saplings by Woodland Scenics, just drilling in there and placing them. And then I'm also putting in some lichen into the scene too, just again to give different textures, to give some variation in height. And here I'm just also adding a little bit of flock onto my piece of lichen, as it is a little bit too bright for the scene. I'm adding some of that burnt grass. And now it's time to worry about adding the most nerve-wracking part, which is the resin. So here I'm creating a dam using some plastic sheeting and also some hot glue to adhere it. And this part will be one of the most difficult parts of this build, as I'll kind of screw it up, which I'll talk about here in a minute. This is a great way to dam things up using hot glue. Resin won't go through the hot glue. Using pieces of plastic card here because the resin won't stick to it. It works well. You just have to be careful when you pour it. And as usual, I'm going to pour too much resin and it will almost break my dam. But I'll talk about that when that happens. And then for backup, I put a little bit of painter's tape around the edges, and that will actually be what saves me here in the end. And then I am taking the resin and I'm adding some blue dye. I put too much dye in here, to be honest. I only wanted a thin hint of blue. I put one too many in on accident, and it's going to be kind of oversaturated. And then I'm going to pour the resin, and here is where, again, I make the mistake that I make every time I pour resin in, that I pour too much resin in and it breaks the dam. Alright, so it starts leaking along the sides, and I don't even notice it until I unwrap the dam and see that it had kind of leaked down to where the tape and the plastic card met, and there was just a film of resin down the side of the diorama, and especially on the wood base, which I had to sand down, and kind of ruined what I was planning on doing with the base, which was staining it a wood color. I couldn't do that anymore, and I had to cover it up with some clay. It was actually a real nightmare. Every time I've made anything with this Envirotex Light resin, I always pour it too deep, and it always causes problems, and I continue that here. So pour less resin than you think. As it settles, it will settle higher than you expect. So just keep that in mind. So as you can see, as I'm adding the waves to the resin, that the resin is just a little too light blue. It looks like something you'd find from the Caribbean, not the North Sea. So to counteract that, I'm taking this Woodland Scenics wave medium and I'm mixing it with some dark blue sea color, also by Woodland Scenics, to kind of counteract that light blue. And this stuff, this wave medium, is a really cool product that I haven't used much before. You just glob tons of the stuff on here, and I use a popsicle stick, and it keeps its form pretty well. So you just work it back and forth, and you can get cresting waves. You can get kind of smaller rolling waves. I just find it to be an amazing product, and I'll be using it whenever I make really any sort of waves in the future, especially waves of any great size. So now that wave gel medium has dried, if you notice, there's a little bit of a shrinkage from the edge. I'm running on a time crunch here because it was about Christmas, so I didn't have time to add more of the gel. The gel also takes a few days to dry before you can really paint it or work with it. So I kind of ran out of time. If I did this again, I'd put some more gel over top of it for a second layer, but oh well. But what I'm doing here is I just took some of that blue sea color from Woodland Scenics, mixed it in with some ivory, and I'm going back and forth over the waves. I'm going both against the grain, kind of horizontally against the waves, and then vertically following kind of the current, and that gives a very realistic, I think, look to the white caps. And then to top it all off, I'm going with just pure ivory without any of the blue in there and hitting the tops of the waves in places that are really jutting out as a high highlight. And I think it looks pretty realistic. And then if you want to go an extra step to just make sure the colors are really well blended in, I watered down some of that blue sea color from Woodland Scenics, and I'm just going to run it over the wave just to make sure to knock down some of the really white portions of the wave, blend it in a little bit better. So now that the waves are done, I need to start painting the earth sections that are kind of cut away on the back of the diorama. So I'm first going over it with some burnt umber all around the sides here. And then when I go and highlight it, I'm going to do something a little bit different. It's going to be a different kind of dry brush. So I'm loading the brush up quite a bit, and I'm just making kind of these horizontal lines across the earth here. Because if you look at kind of a cutout from the earth, there's lots of striations of different colored levels depending on the age of the earth. So I'm just simulating that here by taking that burnt umber, mixing in different amounts of ivory on my wet palette, and so I have a bunch of different shades of brown to pull from, and I'm just going over it. First I'll hit a dark color, then I'll put some light streaks over it, then I'll come back over it with the dark color, and in the end, after you make a few passes, it will look like you have these different layers of earth there, and I think it actually has a pretty nice look in the end. And so then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put down some enamel paint around the wood base here. It will hold up to wear and tear a little bit better than the acrylic paint that I've put everywhere else. And originally I thought, I might actually just keep this black paint. It's nice, it's clean. All right, I originally wanted to do that wood grain, but when the resin leaked, I couldn't do that. But I just didn't like how it kind of clashed with the brown on the back of the diorama. So I instead decided, I'm going to do the kind of same earth color to that lip. And I did the striations all over that. And I do think it turned out better. Not ideal. It really would have been awesome if I could have got a nice dark wood stain on that. But, in model building and terrain building, you make do with what you got. So the final step is just to kind of hide that lip where the fur and the foam meet. And with that, I'm just putting in some coarse turf and also just some fine turf. I'm using the light green and the burnt grass for the really fine turf and mixing those all together. And it does a great job of hiding that lip and giving you something that will catch your eye as you're looking at the back of the diorama. And so we just cover the entirety with that, and then all we have to do is place our figures and our ship in, and we will be done. So here is the diorama having finally been finished. I added my Viking characters there, so it looks like they've just disembarked from their longship, reaching northern England to cause some trouble. And in the end, I think it turned out pretty well. It took probably 40 or 50 hours of work. There were definitely some problems. As I talked about, the resin didn't quite work out as well. And it just took way longer than I would have expected. But overall, I especially am pleased with how the foliage and the grass looked, and how mixing the faux fur with other pieces of flock into the fur itself actually turned out pretty good. So I'll be using that in the future whenever I want to get a really realistic look to my grass. And I also really liked these waves, this wave medium by Woodland Scenics. I think it will be very useful for other shoreline terrain that I make in the future. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you got something out of this video that you will be able to bring to your own hobby. If you did enjoy it, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you all soon. Take care.